You know what's really sad is the way theology actually drives biblical studies, at least among the Bible believing. We believe that the language experts are studying the Bible very closely and then informing the theologians about what they find. It's actually the other way around. The theologians who don't know the Bible as well set the parameters for the exegetes and the language experts, the Bible scholars in Hebrew and Greek, and tell them what they're allowed to say. And that's just a fact. And one of the saddest evidences of this is classical theism forces interpretation of words like Hesed, which is the most important theological term in the Old Testament. And because theologians say we must view God as one who dictates, the word Hesed is seen to be a covenant word that simply means God is faithful, and that just means he does what he says he's going to do. But the reality is that the word Hesed is much more fluid and relational and comes from a place of emotion and is just an expression of love and generosity and kindness. And it's not just pointing to, when it's applied to God, not just pointing to God's faithfulness to do what he says. That is what the theologians tell the biblical scholars it must mean. And therefore the biblical scholars lock into that. But Jesus himself has his own take on the word Hesed. And it's really easy to kind of dig out what that is. When you look at Matthew chapter 9, Jesus is surrounded by sinners, tax collectors, prostitutes, people that are have fallen outside of the bounds of covenant. They're actually under the judgment of God. And Jesus quotes Hosea 6:6 and tells the religious elites of his time that they need to go study very specifically the concept, the Old Testament concept of Hesed. But it's a little tricky if you don't know the original languages. But Jesus says, go and learn what this means. He does this again in Matthew as well. He tells the religious people, go and learn what this means. And the focus of the verse that he's quoting, Hosea 6:6, in Greek, the gospel authors used the word elios, which is the Greek stand-in for the synoptic authors for the word Hesed, uses the word elios. But what he's saying is go understand the Old Testament concept of Hesed, which is just a magnanimous, generous overflowing of God towards all humanity, and in that context specifically, the worst of sinners in the culture who are outside of covenant. God have no obligation to them because they're walking in wickedness. And Jesus basically tells the religious people in his time, go learn what this word concept means. I want you to behave this way. And the focal point is Hesed. Also in Hosea it says that people have lost sight of a knowledge of God. And then in Hebrew parallelism shows you what this means. It means that they've lost sight of God's Hesed. So God's Hesed, God's central attribute, is a overflowing, generous, compassionate kindness towards the utterly, completely undeserving. According to Jesus, it is not just his faithfulness to do what he said he's going to do for people who are in covenant with him. And this is Jesus' interpretation. But this is another problem as well. Sadly, we have followed, this is a completely different strain of sabotage that's come into biblical studies. We have followed German thinkers who are liberal and don't even believe the Bible, and kind of bifurcated. Instead of seeing the Old Testament and New Testament as a whole and seeing Jesus as someone who can illumine Old Testament concepts, we don't listen to what Jesus says about the word Hesed, because if we did, we would be more inclined to a much more generous, relational, emotional interpretation of that word. But this all just points back to kind of the demonic sabotage that happens in biblical studies. It's not the biblical scholars, the experts in the original languages, that are telling the theologians what they should be saying. It's the theologians who have told the biblical scholars, you're not allowed to say anything beyond what we've already determined must come out of Scripture. So anyway, this just was a thought that kind of hit me this morning, and for those who are a little further along in their biblical studies, hopefully this will challenge you.